Hello and welcome to a very special milestone in our beginner tutorial series. Today we've kind of learned enough of the foundations of web development and JavaScript, HTML, CSS, all these pieces to be able to put them together in React and kind of take our basic skills and bring it into a modern framework that people are using all of the time in big tech and in Bitcoin to build apps. Build web apps, different kinds of apps actually. So let's get into it. There's a lot of information to cover, but with the JavaScript tutorials, just like those before, I'm going to split this up into multiple. But first of all, if you don't know, for context, this is our, beginner tutorial. This is number 5 in our beginner tutorial series here on the Plebdevs YouTube channel. So we started with HTML, CSS, started from the absolute beginning, and we're moving our way up kind of in complexity up the stack. And here we are at React. It's pretty cool. So these are the links that you are going to want today. I've got the link to these slides that I'm in right here. It's at tinyurl.com/plebdevs React tutorial. And then the link to the completed project, which we are going to build pretty quickly today. So these slides, you're going to want these slides because they have some code in it, as well as just, the content that we're going to go over here. So let's get into it. We're going to do some theory, and then we're going to bring it very quickly into practice. So let's get started. So overview of what we're going to talk about: what is React, why you should learn and use React. We're going to look at the anatomy of a React app, just kind of see what we're dealing with React here. And then we're going to look into React hooks, which is a very basic React concept. It's very powerful. And we're going to use these concepts that we learned to build a single page React app. And it's going to be basically something similar to what we've built before. We're going to show the Bitcoin price, but it's a good example to run with and start with when you're learning something new. Cool. So from the top, what is React? React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces, particularly for single-page applications where you need fast, interactive user experiences. So that's a pretty good summary, not too much more to say there, but I'll give you my perspective on this. So this is the basic web dev stack that we've learned so far. You have HTML, you have CSS, you have JavaScript, where the HTML is kind of creating the structure, the CSS, we're stylizing it, and then with JavaScript, we're adding interactivity, essentially. So a bit about React versus HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Here we have two of the same pieces of code. They're doing the same things. We have a piece of JavaScript code over here to the left and React code on the right. And essentially all that we're doing is we're predefining an array of fruits, and we're creating a list of that, and we're iterating through that list and essentially creating elements and writing them onto the page. So writing all of the fruits onto the page. And this is what you have to do with the kind of basic DOM manipulation in vanilla JavaScript. And down here in React, we can see how much cleaner that code like this can be. We're essentially just defining the array of items here. We have a function item list, and this function is able to return HTML right here. And we're able to use the items.map method and then create an LI, a list item for each item. So it's just a lot more concise and generic, which is good for writing user interfaces, and much more than that as well. So that's kind of this is the pitch right here, right? You wanna be writing the same quality of code with less lines of code, and there's more reasons to use React, which we'll kind of get into. So from a high level, what is React really doing? So React is essentially taking this concept of a DOM, which we learned in the past tutorial, and it is creating a virtual DOM, actually. So React creates a virtual copy of your web page's structure, compares this copy to the actual web page, updating only what's changed. So this makes React fast and efficient at keeping your page up to date. So with HTML, we have the DOM, and with React, we have the virtual DOM, okay? And so a bit more about React from the high level. The virtual DOM in React is a virtual representation of the actual DOM. It is nothing but an object created to replicate the actual DOM. So the virtual DOM is cheap to create because it doesn't actually write anything to the screen. It's just kind of representing it in an object. And it's just a strategy to keep you from having to redraw the screen and again, which happens to speed up these web apps very fast. So we see the simple difference here of the basic flow. We have a web page where updates and events are going to the real DOM. And here with React, we just have this virtual DOM, which sits in the middle, which does our reads and writes for us. Now, we're not actually doing any of this. We don't have to literally define any of this. This is just how React works under the hood. And we're just going to be able to leverage it very simply. So don't get intimidated if this seems very abstract. It is pretty abstract from where we're going to be working, but it is what's happening in the background. So good to understand. So a bit more on why to use and learn React. So, I mean, really, it is the industry standard. It's you're going to have a better time, learning React and getting your first programming job, for example. React has to be one of the best languages to get proficient at and use and show that you can use and then be able to get a job from it. It really allows you to condense a lot of topics in app development into one framework, one language, at least on the client side. So it really is the industry standard. There's other similar frameworks that are popular, but React is what I know and love. So it's also easy to learn, in my opinion. Some people will say the contrary. I think it's actually easy to learn. I think it's actually easier than vanilla JavaScript, what we have been learning. There's just a few concepts that we have to grapple with first before it does become easy. And then, of course, we have tons of amazing libraries and packages with React that we can leverage. So a lot of code, a lot of really cool things, components and UI, they've already been created before with React, and we can just reuse them very easily with packages. Great. So let's talk about one. Let's actually look at some React code here with JSX. So JSX, earlier we saw with this little code snippet, we've got this function. This function is returning HTML, right? That's kind of one of the big ideas, how I would pitch React to someone that doesn't know anything. But very specifically, it's returning something called JSX. So JSX is a syntax extension for React that allows you to write HTML-like code directly in your JavaScript files. So that's why we're able to actually write that HTML there inside of that function. So it essentially combines JavaScript and HTML together in a syntax where they both work together. And it makes the UI code a lot more readable and intuitive, and it compiles down to regular JavaScript functions down below. So yeah, like here we have a JSX version of some code. We define a name and we can just return or create an element with that name variable inside of it, versus with JavaScript where we have to, create that element, create the name, and then interact with the DOM in this very manual way. Okay, great. So let's create a new React app on Replit and kind of explore the structure of it. Now that we have these basic concepts, we know what's happening in the background. We know kind of this idea that we're going to be dealing with here, functions that return HTML. And we know some terminology about, kind of what's happening there, but let's make it a little more concrete. So I've got the final project here on Replit, but I'll go home on Replit and I can create a new Replit. Now Replit's free. You might need to sign up with GitHub or something like that, but it is totally free. So I'll create new REPL. I'll select React, and we can just leave our default name here. Sweet, and it will spin up. Okay, so what we are immediately given, let me squeeze this away and give us some zoom here. We're immediately brought to an index.html file. So we're kind of familiar with this. We've dealt with HTML before, but this is being used a little bit differently in the concept of a React app. Essentially, how React app works, it's this additional framework, right? Where we're creating this virtual DOM, we have JSX, there's these different features. But these features in this framework, it's kind of injected into a regular HTML file. So that's the trick of what's happening here. And that's kind of the reason that React apps and similar types of apps, they have a certain structure to the folders and the files. So here we can see that, you know, we're in index.html. We also have a vite config. And then we have this source folder with some JS files inside of it. And then a public folder. This just holds images and stuff like that. So essentially what's happening here, where our app begins, is index.html. That's what the page renders. But index.html has a few scripts here. This is actually mostly just replit stuff. But the important thing that it has here is it has this root element. So this div with an ID of root. And then we have a script that points to index.jsx. So from here, let's go to index.jsx. Okay, so what's happening in this file is we're importing React, we're importing the React library and the React DOM. And then we're saying create root document.get element by ID root.render. So what are we doing here? We're calling regular JavaScript from the DOM to essentially wrap our index.html page, or that root element specifically, wrap it in the React library. And so this happens in index.jsx. So we have index.html, this is the root, it holds the root. Index.jsx inserts React into the root. And then where we actually write our code is going to be here in app.jsx. So this is a very standard structure: index.html, index JavaScript, and then app JavaScript. That's going to be a structure that you're going to see a lot. And a lot of times when you create a new React app, you're not going to look at these two files. You're just going to jump right here into app.jsx and just start writing code. Cool. So that is a pretty basic structure right there. Two other pieces that we want to see here, which is very important. We're not going to go super in depth in this lesson, but it is package.json, package.lock.json, and node modules. And so let's start with package.json. This is a high level, essentially, configuration for your whole entire website or app. So we have name, we have version, description, stuff like that. But most importantly, and where you'll mostly be using package.json in the future, is we have scripts which can be run and executed inside of here, and dependencies. And dependencies are the other libraries that we can bring in to enhance our app. So package.json will define these, and anytime we run, npm install, Axios or something like that, that will get added into package.json. Package.lock.json, this locks in the version of all of these packages or dependencies that we call them. So that's all it's doing. It's just really defining the versions in great detail and then locking them down with hashes, actually. And then node modules holds the code for our actual dependencies that we're using. And so all of this is spun up by default for us inside of Replit, and it's also spun up through other means. You can use something called create React app, or this is actually using Vite, V-I-T-E, under the hood. But we just have this boilerplate. All of that is in place, and we can just start writing and running our code. So let's run what's here right now. And cool, it just says React, Vite, and Replit. And we see like we saw before, we just have a function that is returning HTML. Very cool. Okay, let's go back into the slides. So kind of a basic anatomy of a React app there. Let's get into React hooks now. And this is gonna be the other kind of final new concept here. So hooks are special functions in React that let you use React features in simple components. Hooks let you use things like state and lifecycle methods without writing complex class components. All hook names start with use, such as use state or use effect. Okay, you might not have context for some of this, but there have been different eras of how you write JavaScript and React code, and it's always been a problem to have, let's say, functions in your web code that listen for things to happen or listen for certain timings or get triggered off of certain conditions. And that's also deal with certain data that might change. That's what a lot of hooks are used for, is to manage effects, basically functions that get called at certain times, and then to manage state, which state is just basically data that lives inside of a front-end app. So that's what a lot of hooks are meant for. We're gonna see this in action. I think it'll be a little more clear when we see the code, but stick with me. So all hook names, they start with use. This naming helps developers remember they're using a special React feature, and hooks just make it easier to write and manage React code. All right, so let's start with the use state hook. This is the most kind of primary and important hook in React. The use state hook allows you to create, update, and manipulate state inside of functional components. So functional components, when you hear that, just think React, a React function that returns HTML. That's essentially what a component in React is. So state, so we're essentially saving memory here, and we're able to update it, we're able to manipulate it. Okay, so React has this concept of state, which are variables that hold data that our components depend on and may change over time. Whenever these variables change, React updates the UI by re-rendering the component and the DOM with the current values of the state variables. So this code snippet is a good example of this in action. You can see that we're defining use state right here. Well, first of all, we import use state from React at the top. And then inside of our function, we say const count set count equals use state 0. So what this is doing is inside of an array, we have two values here. One is the value of our state. And then the other is a setter, which lets us set or reset our state. And then we say equals use state, and then this 0 here is the default value. So if we console log count on the very next line, what we would see is 0, because that's the default value. But then we could set count to 1 and then console log it, and it would be 1, of course. And this is just an example of a component that you just click a button and it sets the count to count plus 1. So it's just incrementing the count. So this is a good example of like how React works. And you're not having to think about redrawing the screen manually. Every time that this count variable changes, since this variable is a piece of state, React will just know to re-render. Okay, so that is the use state in a very basic level. You've got the value of the state and then the setter. And of course you can name these whatever you want. I might call it like sats, set sats, or something like that, right? Okay, let's talk about use effect hook now. So the use effect hook is a very important and generic hook. And what it essentially lets us do is it lets us run other code at a certain time. This is what use effect does. So let's actually jump. Yeah, let's jump to some code before we walk through that description. So let's look at this simple component effect will run each time the component renders. So we define use effect right here. And then inside of our simple component, we have this thing use effect and then console.log component mounted. And it says empty dependency array here. Our other one, we have another one right here, use effect. This one has count inside of this array and console logging every time the count changed. So what's happening here is use effect is essentially a function that lets you, lets you run code at certain times. So if this dependency array, which is what they call it, if this is empty, this code will run every time the page renders. If it has a value in it, it will run every time that value changes. Much like how our JSX will re-render every single time that the count value will change. So that's the big idea with the use effect, is that it It is a function that lets you run code at certain times depending on what's inside of this dependency array. So that's essentially what this is saying. So the dependency array is an optional value we can pass as the second argument into our useEffect hook. What is in the dependency array will determine when the effect will run. So if I look, I can like zoom in here. Oops, go back. Sorry. So no dependency array, effect will run on every single render. This is basically, you almost never use useEffect like this. It will just keep rerunning and rerunning. Empty dependency array, the effect will run only on the first render. So this is a very, very common pattern that you'll do here. And then we've got non-empty dependency array. The effect will run when any of the dependencies inside of it change. Okay, so we'll see this in action pretty soon. So this is our examples here that we just went through. And so one last thing on useEffect. useEffect is utilizing what we call JavaScript callback functions. So callback functions are just functions that call other functions. It's a pattern that you'll see again and again. So I just want you to not feel totally overwhelmed by it. You know, so like here's an example. We have a higher order function, takes a function as a parameter. So we have const higher order function here equals, and then it receives a callback. A callback is a function that is passed as an argument. And then we return that callback and we invoke it. We basically, we activate that code as we return it. So that's a common pattern for callbacks. And useEffect uses a callback, right? This useEffect, this is a hook where the first argument here is actually an unnamed callback function, and the second argument is an array. As funny as it looks. So why callback functions? A callback is just a function that's passed into another function with the expectation that the callback will be called at the appropriate time. Callback functions are mostly used in areas where the top level higher order function is doing an operation that takes an uncertain amount of time, so that we can basically call the lower level code right when we need to. So here's another example. We have function simple button. It returns button with an on-click handler that passes in this handle click function. So this is actually an example of a callback function right here. I have a piece of code that needs to run to handle a click action. And then of course I have the on-click function, which calls this function. So it doesn't look that confusing here, but it's something that you'll see in React. So I just want you to, you know, not be completely overwhelmed. Okay, so let's build a simple React single page application where you're just gonna fetch and display the Bitcoin price once again. And we're just gonna use our, let's see, I've got this replit already open here. So we're just gonna use this replit and we're only gonna be inside of app.js here. Okay, so first and foremost, we're gonna be adding state for price, and then we're gonna be adding JSX to render price. So I can copy this, and I'm just gonna replace everything here. Great. And one other thing we're gonna need to do is, we're importing Axios here, but we need to install Axios. So you can go to your shell, and we can say npm install Axios, just like that. And let's try and rerun this. Okay, great. So it just says loading USD. So what our code is doing so far, we're importing useState and useEffect from React. We have our app function, and then we're making price and then a setter for price. Using the useState hook, and we're giving it an initial value of actually just loading, just kind of a clever thing to do because initially the price might not be loaded. We have an H1 here where we're saying Bitcoin price, and then a P right here where we are putting the price variable inside of curly brackets. You can tell it's a variable because it's inside of curly brackets here with a $sign before it. Great. great. So this is just completely static. The state isn't really going to change, but of course we see if we, change that, it will update. Kind of hot reload. Okay, great. So we have some state, we have some JSX. So next, we're going to add a use effect to run on render and fetch the price at an interval. Okay, so this is going to sit under the price use state. So let's just copy all of this. And let's stretch this out a little bit. Oh, I defined this twice on accident. There we go. Okay, great. So let's see what's doing here. We can see immediately it's already working. So we have our use effect. Can I collapse this? Let me collapse this. That'll make it simple. So we have our use effect hook right here. Inside of use effect, there's a function called fetch price. So first of all, notice that our dependency array on use effect is empty. So that means it will run on the first render. So we have a function called fetch price. We call fetch price, and then we define a new interval of 3 seconds to call fetch price. And then we essentially just return that interval every single time it runs. So this is another common pattern. It may not make a ton of sense at this moment, but it's a very common pattern for doing an interval. And then inside of fetch price, we've seen this before, axios.get. We're getting our BTC USD spot price. Then we handle a response, setting price to response.data.data.amount. And then .catch, we can catch any error. And so there we have it. Every 3 seconds, this price is on a complete refresh of the page. This price is refetched and the page is instantly re-rendered automatically with React. And this is all of our code here. So just really appreciate, I know that some of this code, it may be a little bit dense and maybe a little unfamiliar. Specifically, probably some of the stuff in the use effect, but we've done something like this before with fetch price. Intervals, you can learn about intervals. We can learn more about cleanup functions in the future, but it's amazing how little code this actually is, how simple you can make something so functional. If we compare, let's actually compare this against the past, what was it? JS tutorial DOM, I think was our last one, or one of our last ones. No, our last one was async. Let's go to that one. JS tutorial async. So this is doing the same thing, a little bit more, but let's look at how much more code it has. Yeah, way more code, ugly DOM manipulation. Still pretty clean overall. But I don't know, just something about the React code just looks so clean to me. So there we have it. This is all the code with some additional comments that I threw in. So you might just copy this and paste it in instead, but just, look how simple and elegant that is. And so this is just one page or one component inside of React, but eventually we'll be able to build multiple pages of functional pieces of UI like this, and we're going to be able to combine them into much bigger apps. And so that's what's really cool about React. And so we're going to learn more about, I guess, how you would structure a more complicated React app with the next lesson. We're going to go over React components, but I hope this was helpful. There's obviously a ton of other resources that you should look into for React, and we only looked into some very basic concepts this time, but hopefully it was enough along with our last lessons to get you started. So as always, keep an eye out for the future tutorials beyond this one, and feel free to reach out to me and just get further involved with Plebdevs at plebdevs.com. We have a Discord community, of course, the YouTube channel, and courses. So check that out, and I'll see you all next time.